Hi there, folks. Welcome to episode 14 of Nintendo Deep Dive. My name is Carl. I am the creator and host of this podcast. To those uninitiated, Nintendo Deep Dive is a retrospective focused Nintendo show all about retro Nintendo games and retro Nintendo machines, often featuring retrospective reviews. To those listening via audio platforms, these episodes are also available with video on YouTube under Nintendo Deep Dive. I will just jump right into reviewing Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages, as it is all I got on the docket for today. So this is me jumping in. The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. Released in North America on May 13th, 2001, developed by the now disbanded Flagship and published by Nintendo, directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi, though he was credited as planner in the credits. But since then, he has received the director credit on the last three 3D Zelda games. He was also credited as a designer alongside Yuichiro Ikeda and Sol Chol Lee, with art done by Yasuke Nakano, the Yasuke Nakano, Zelda's official artist for many years. And also compositions done by Minako Idachi and Kirahiro Seda. Ikeda's career continued on into the Devil May Cry franchise with him as the lead game designer for Devil May Cry 5. And as for Minako Idachi, she joined Game Freak in 2009 and has been involved in the Pokemon soundscape for as many as half a dozen mainline titles, going all the way back to Black and White. And Kirahiro Seda was and still is the president of Pure Sound Inc., who have had a hand in many game soundtracks. So, a pretty talented pedigree all in all. Before I speak to the game itself, I'll just say that I will not be getting into the nuts and bolts of this game's mechanics or its visuals, as I already did that in my Oracle of Seasons review. So, to put it simply, Ages like Seasons is cut from the cloth that is Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, with the same aesthetic, controls, and general gameplay, while also borrowing NPCs from the N64 titles. Still very much its own game, though with new assets, ideas, and characters made just for it. All that said, I would describe Ages, and by extension Seasons, as a standard meat and potatoes Zelda game that appeals to the more hardcore Zelda player than, say, the newcomer. Not to say that it would be a bad start point, but Ages and Seasons are dense with Zelda gameplay and design, and if you are not familiar with that design language, Oracle of Ages is going to be daunting. But as I already said, for the well-initiated Zelda fan, both Oracle games are slabs of meat to sink your teeth into, and additionally, I will say that they, alongside titles like Pokemon, are Game Boy games at their beefiest. As for how Oracle of Ages compares to Oracle of Seasons and I will be making a few comparisons in this video between the two, as I find that it is often neglected by other people to remind people who are not aware of these games that they are, in fact, very different. Pardon me. So, getting into that, the key difference often stated is that Seasons is focused on combat and Ages on puzzles. I have always disliked this statement, even though it's broadly correct. But unless you are actively comparing them, these differing emphases are not going to stand out all that much. Heck, altogether I have played them 9 times, and those specific distinctions continue to be incidental. Particularly with Seasons, as ostensibly it is a regular Zelda game with regular portions of navigation, puzzles, and combat. As for Oracle of Ages, the game being reviewed, its emphasis on puzzles is more apparent due to the sheer quantity of puzzles and or puzzle-adjacent activities. Not just in comparison to Seasons, but to the rest of the franchise as well. Spirit Tracks probably has more puzzles, as might Majora's Mask, but that's not important. The point is that this oft-cited distinction between Oracle games is not all that major. As far as I am concerned, the big distinction between the two is that Ages was the principal game in development, or has every indication it was. It features a more involved story than Seasons, more big set piece moments, and a more developed overworld. Seasons was by no means undercooked, but like the overworld of its inspiration, so much of the land of Holodrum is unclaimed wilderness, with dungeon entrances sprinkled throughout with little fanfare. Moreover, the vast majority of the NPCs and the quests they set you on are only related to the main adventure indirectly, and in and of themselves, only a few of them are involved enough to be interesting. As for Ages, all of that missing pomp and circumstance is very much present. For instance, the story. Spoilers for the few not in the know. You have 5 seconds to vacate. Though, where are you going to vacate to? I don't know. I'll put a timestamp in later, maybe. Anyway, I hope you all vacated. Taking place in Labrina, it starts with Nehru, who, after performing a very pretty song, gets captured and possessed by Varen, who then travels back in time some hundreds of years ago to the time of Queen Ambi, who was in the middle of constructing a great tower in the center of Labrina. The queen is not evil by any means, as the purpose of her tower is to be a lighthouse for her lover, lost at sea. But she takes the help offered by the possessed oracle, who fixes the sun in its place, creating a day without end, so that those working will not be interrupted by the coming of the night. Unfortunately, too consumed by her desperate task, the queen is oblivious to the cries of her overworked people, the very cries with which Varen is using to light the flame of sorrow, which, when lit alongside the flame of chaos, will set in motion the unholy resurrection rites of the Demon King himself. Nothing crazy, to be sure, but it's a solid fantasy story premise, and a lot more elaborate than Seasons' narrative, though they are part of the same overall story. Add a few memorable characters like the always in a hurry Ralph, and you have a decent Zelda story. Story aside, another strong aspect of Oracle of Ages is its set-piece moments. Like other Zelda games, Oracle of Ages has larger instances between its dungeons to punctuate the pace. There's a Lost Woods section with what might be the most annoying music in any Zelda game. Not that I do not appreciate that. Rolling Ridge, where the Gorons dwell, is basically a mini-game land, and you have to beat all of them. There's the library with the invisible pathways, and also the castle courtyard that is a callback to Ocarina's courtyard. Did I say that weird? Ocarina's courtyard. Ocarina's? Ocarina. But the best of them is on Crescent Isle. After setting off onto the ocean with a raft, Link is taken by a storm and washes up on this isle, unconscious. Its denizens, these lizard people, strip him of all of his items and then flee as he comes to. Of course, the task at hand is to then reacquire your missing inventory, and with each reacquisition, a new part of the isle is unlocked. It is very similar to the Eldin section of the Dragon Song quest in Skyward Sword, which makes sense as Fujibayashi directed both. Even so, there's one difference I can think of, and that is the item trading element on Crescent Isle. While most of your items can be found out on the island, the Rock's Feather and the Strength Bracelet have to be traded for the shovel. And since you only have one shovel, you can only have one of them. And will have to retrade for the other when required. Unless you have 10-cent seeds. But anyways. The section is over when you get to the dungeon entrance, wherein your remaining missing items are returned to you, which I assume means that the section can be completed with different routes. Like, I imagine you can get all your items on your own before getting to the dungeon entrance. But if you do it more efficiently, then, well, you don't need all of them, and then you just have them returned to you. Additionally, the Crescent Isle section serves as a showcase for the game's time travel mechanic, which I should probably talk about as it is the key gimmick of the game. And it really comes into play on Crescent Isle, as you have to jump between the present and past more frequently than you previously had done up to this point. And there's a nice little moment in that where you plant a seedling in the past, and in the present, pardon me, it has grown into a special tree. But segueing from Crescent Isle, which is clearly one of my favorite moments in the game, to the specifics of the time travel mechanic. If you have played Link to the Past, you will immediately see that the time travel mechanic is the same as the Dark World, Light World traversal. Granted, it starts out more limited and by the end is less rigid than Link to the Past dimension hopping, but it is the very same thing. Initially, you can only travel to the past or present with warp tiles, and then you get another song that lets you travel to the present from anywhere in the past, but not vice versa. Outside of the time ripple / portal you leave behind, which is identical to how the Link to the Past mirror works. And then the final song lets you hop between the two as you like. It may not be as original as the season changing found in Seasons, but sometimes old is better than new. While the season change mechanic added some visual variety, from a design perspective, moving forward was a simple process of elimination. Outside of Tarm runes, which required some proper sequencing and creative doubling back. But otherwise, finding the stump from which to swing the rod was the hardest part. As for Ages' time travel, while one could certainly time hop speculatively and find some success, it's more enjoyable and less time consuming to learn to anticipate when you need to be time hopping. And the process of learning to anticipate is very gratifying. Typically speaking, if I found myself in part of the map that was noticeably empty, both in the exteriors and interiors, that meant the area was supposed to be explored in the other tents. Or if the ground was down below or high up on a cliff, it is very likely that the topography will be different in the other time period, with paths that were once broken up by cliffs now continuous with one another. That is how I learned to read the map and use the mechanic. There's also additional considerations that I picked up on, one being that the Isles in the Sea have shifted right a couple tiles in the present from where they were in the past, and on the land, seismic activity has elevated certain places. In addition to being useful information, the small inconsistencies between the time periods serves as a nice little wrinkle in the world building. Overall, the time travel mechanic may not be original nor necessarily used as creatively as what it's imitating, but it is solid as core conceits go, and it's perfectly fine that the developer revisited it, as it is much stronger than many other conceits used in the other Zelda games. One thing I find interesting about traveling between the past and present is how they populated the maps. One might assume that Ages has two maps worth of content, but it in fact is not. And that's fine. It's totally fine. It does not lack for content, but between the past and present, it is essentially one map's worth of exploration. If you find a wealth of content in the past, in the present you might find mere artifacts of that in empty caverns and fields. One amusing example of this is the musical maestro's underwater lair, which is located in a pool up in the mountains. His lair is made apparent by one tile of water appearing deeper than the rest. So naturally, you would dive at that spot, which takes you to an underwater cavern with a ladder leading to the maestro's study. But in the present, the pool is all dried up, with the one deep spot now just a bottomless pit. I fell into it just to make sure. For myself, I like that attention to mundane detail, but for others, they might bemoan a half-filled map, which of course would be ridiculous on them. Having two near identical maps, dense with stuff, would be suffocating and also pointless. No doubt, though, that modern-day Mr. Fujibayashi would put a Korok there to validate that empty section of dirt. As for the rest of Labrina, it's significantly more populated and civilized than Holodrum, though admittedly, Lena City / Village is village. I don't know what I said there. Lena City / Village is too scattered and small to effectively resemble an actual town. But aside from it, there's some memorable locales. The Black Tower made for an ominous presence. The citizens of Symmetry left me smiling with their balance dilemmas, and there was a real sense of magic and developer ambition in finding Zora's domain beneath the sea's billows. Just the fact that they made a large underwater biome on the Game Boy says it all. There's also Crescent Isle, let us not forget. So overall, some pretty good locales in Oracle of Ages. Now, the point of this review is not to endlessly compare the two Oracle games to each other, but the point I am trying to make is that Oracle of Ages seems to be the principal game. And because of that, I do think it is a better game than Seasons. But Seasons is still very good. A 7.5 out of 10. And in all other comparisons, that being the typical comparisons that people make between Zelda games, dungeons, bosses, items, the Oracle games go toe-to-toe with one another, with both being very strong in these brackets. In fact, if I was thinking along the lines of top 10 Zelda this or top 10 Zelda that, the Oracle games have reserved spots on such lists. Not just for me, but also for most Zelda fans familiar with them and the series as a whole. Seasons' Magnet Glove and Ages' Switch Hook would definitely make it onto most top 10 items lists. Sword and Shield Dungeon and Mermaid Cave would make many best dungeons lists as well. And the Medusa Head and Shamrock, they would be candidates for best bosses. And that's failing to mention the Rock's Cape, the Seed Shooter, Unicorn's Cave and Crown Dungeon, also Smog and Dark Dragon Onyx. Now, between the two of them, I would say Ages has better dungeons by a fair degree, both in structure and in individual puzzles, as well as core conceits. But Seasons has the better items. As for bosses, Ages, they're more conceptually interesting, with the emphasis on the dungeon item, but the more difficult Seasons bosses make for more satisfying fights, the emphasis being on the sword. Overall, Seasons might edge out Ages on that category. Not that such categories really matter. I think it's sad that I've seen YouTubers use such parameters for determining the ascendancy of one Zelda game over another in what is basically a tally system. Simply put, that is a wrong way to evaluate software. Leaves out the important questions like how all the disparate items, or not items, how all the disparate elements gel together. Are they complementary, or are they at odds with one another? That sort of categorical thinking and comparison also fails to quantify the degree to which a title excels in said categories. It is silly. Do not do it. With that said, no more comparisons between the two games. I'm just going to talk about Ages. It's hard to say. I'm just going to talk about its gameplay now, though I'm not going to go too in depth. As mentioned, Ages has many puzzles. The first dungeon you go into really acclimates you to the idea of block pushing, which I figured would be tedious, but it was not actually. And more importantly, that is just the starting point, meant to put you in the mindset that you're not just going to be passing through these chambers in a minimal interaction capacity. In addition to the usual suspects, Ages has a few of its own special puzzle assets, not seen anywhere else outside of it or Seasons, though do not hold me to that. For example, there is the turnstiles that I previously delved into in my Seasons review, an undertaking that strained my descriptive language skills, and I will not be delving again, other than to say that they are more prominently featured in Ages. In fact, there is a room in Mermaid's Cave that features two of them at once, in what is essentially a maze configuration, with the goal being to orientate/pre-orientate them in proper sequence to properly pass through them in a manner that will move you in your desired direction. Some find them intimidating, possibly even vexing, but I enjoy them greatly, as they make me stop and think about the dungeon rooms around them. And on that score, they are never repetitive, as they themselves are not the object of bemusement, but rather it is the dungeon orientated around them, with each dungeon being orientated differently. Essentially, the turnstiles are a task of navigation and sequentiality. It's a hard word. They are featured in 3 of the 8 dungeons, if I am not mistaken. Another puzzle that Oracle of Ages has, and it's only featured in the Oracle of Ages and at least once in Minish Cap, is the step on all the tiles in the room, but never the same one twice challenge. If anyone can do better with naming that, please pass it on. This one is how I described it. You turn the blue tiles yellow by treading on them. Once they are all yellow, you get to your prize. But daren't you double back onto already yellowed tile, lest the challenge need restarting. This puzzle appears several times in the game, with difficulty variation coming from how many obstructive statues are placed in the room and where they are placed. I never tired of seeing this puzzle, as it's very dazzlingly colorful, and it requires one to stop and think. A common refrain with Ages' puzzles. The thing with Ages' puzzles is that, unlike the mirror pushing in Ocarina's Spirit Temple, you can't rely on accidentally solving them. They were not built with a release valve. You have to solve them with intent. Such is especially the case with the different color-sided die that has to be rolled onto its receiver with the denoted side down, or was it up? No matter. Very mundane puzzle for many, I presume, but it's very ruthless, as if you fail to manage the limited floor space, you will roll the die up against a wall or beside a ledge, and Link cannot roll it back towards himself. He is too much of an idiot. There are perhaps too many of them, and they are rather mundane in concept, but I enjoy the challenge, though I only brought them up as an example in intentful puzzle solving, that which is required for Ages' puzzles. And I think that is a good place to leave it for puzzle talk. Not that there are not more that could be discussed. Touching on items, it is a pretty solid roster, the 3 big ones being the switch hook, the seed shooter, and the mermaid suit. The mermaid suit makes for opportunity to be in more aquatic environments, and also makes Link quite nimble in the water. The seed shooter's ability to ricochet projectiles off walls is innately satisfying, but the game's best item is the switch hook. Similar to the hook shot, Link shoots out a chain with a grabbing apparatus, which can kill smaller enemies, but for bigger foes and other objects, like say pots, the switch hook grabs them, and then Link trades places with said foe or object, not far off from teleportation, and there's a satisfying chime that goes with it. Not only does it help link cross gaps, it is also essential for grabbing and placing objects, usually for pressure switches, but also for the purpose of setting up escape routes when required. Personally, I like using it for bypassing combat encounters. If a Dark Knight is coming at me, I throw out the hook, and voila, he is now behind me, facing the wrong way as I make my getaway. Really great item. To speak on the items in the most general sense, though, having items be the centerfold of dungeons remains a winning formula. Has not gotten stale yet. There is a great pace variation that comes with it, as in the first half of the dungeon's runtime, you are taking the long paths, all the while vexed by obstacles and out-of-reach goodies, and then that shift happens. That change of pace as you get your new toy. And as I said, a winning formula. Speaking of the dungeons, they are all very good, except maybe the last one. Aegis hits the ground running with them and stays running. Much of their quality is owed to the puzzles, but it is also in part to the variations in pace and structure. For instance, Moonlit Grotto serves as a puzzle box dungeon, your main goal being to knock the turnstile at the center of the first floor down to the second, which you do by destroying the key linchpins holding the structure fast. Then for the dungeon after, that being the fourth dungeon, it is paced and structured like a linear combat gauntlet, with pools of magma serving as a key hazard. Following that, Crown Palace is very open in structure, its main conceit being the dichotomous switch pillars, one always down and one always up. Choose as needed. Dungeons 7 and 8 are similarly open in structure, while 6, also known as Mermaid's Cave, is separated into two near identical dungeons, one past, the other present. I feel I've made my point. Even so, to remain on dungeons for a little while longer, one dungeon that I had determined to be flawed redeemed itself in my eyes, that being Jabu Jabu's Belly, Aegis' penultimate dungeon. Granted, most people, not just myself, have cast aspersions on this one. But those people are dumb. And I am dumb. Because what we all had trouble with was something that the game spelt out in plain words via the hint owl statues. The golden isles float on top of the water, or something along those lines. That's what they say. What it is referring to are these elevated landings, the sides or banks of which are golden in color. I do not know how I misconstrued that blatant explanation, but I did. Maybe I just forgot the hint, but that does not make sense, as that hint owl is placed appropriately close to one of those said isles. Speaking to the nature of these isles, they essentially are like buoys floating atop the water, as said by the friendly owl. But like Ocarina of Time's water temple, the water temple can be raised to 3 different points. Those points being the ceiling of each dungeon floor. The Golden Isles are raised with it, of course, being slotted into the moon door of the floor above, so as to remain prominent, regardless of where the water level is set. If you raise the water all the way, one of the golden isles will bridge a gap between two ledges, allowing you to progress to the end. But only if you manage to utilize this key information. It is important to realize that the player is often more at fault than the developer, and complaining about something you or I screwed up will compel developers to cater to the weaknesses of their player base rather than their strength. So as to say, Jabu Jabu's Belly was quite good. I got real lost in it for a good spell, but I approve of that. Being forced to take inventory of one's surroundings on occasion makes for compelling gameplay. As for the final dungeon, Ancient Tomb or something like that, not particularly good. It features solid puzzles, though most are iterations on what has come before. But its main problem is that the developer sought to impress me with its sheer size and nothing else. Having neither proper gameplay/puzzle motifs nor interesting structure to liven its pace. Not a terrible dungeon by any means. In fact, it features a great mini-boss and boss, but perhaps the weakest dungeon in the game. Since I touched on bosses, it is a solid roster. The best of them is Smog. He may have a weak character sprite, but the act of bringing his disparate pieces back together via a push block is simple but genius. I have always liked the Cane of Samaria. There is great utility in summoning your own push block, and this game used it very well. The jellyfish is pretty swank as well. The jellyfish from Jabu Jabu's Belly, because I don't remember his name. Switching places with him via the you-know-what item to make him eat his own projectile. Both devious and churlish, and I love it. Then there's Shamrock, who has 4 to 5 different phases, and they're very difficult phases too. Those are the highlights, those 2 bosses, or those 3 bosses. The final fight against Varen is solid enough as well. Does not rank terribly high in the list of Zelda final bosses, but it is good. Lots of different phases, with the one I particularly like being the creepy fairy, on account of the rows of dark links mirroring your movements, not your moments, mirroring your movements. It is a cool image and a tricky hazard too. Last thing I should talk about before we score this game, because that is what we are coming up upon, the game's flaws. There really is not all that many. The limited buttons on the gameplay were a bigger issue than in Seasons, particularly in one instance where you're fighting Varen because you have to use your sword and 2 other items, which is a problem when you only have 2 buttons. Never really was a problem in Seasons, as I said. But even for ages, though I brought it up, it does not factor into anything. Then there is the Goron dance section, and really just the entire second half of Rolling Ridge. I'm not going to get into it. If you know, you know. But I will say that for the second Goron Dancing Master, the developer requiring the player to have a letter of introduction in order to obtain the dungeon key, pretty terrible, as there is no reason the player would assume that an additional item was required. Instead, they would assume that they had to beat each of the 3 dance difficulties, or maybe that they needed to do one of them without mistakes. The fact that one Goron, who looks like all the other Goron, makes a funny comment is no indication of anything. It was just flavor text. But apparently it was not. That was complete nonsense. Poor design reminiscent of a lesser Rare game. Even then, though, an incidental issue, even though, gosh, I got so mad at it. Ooh, it was terrible. Anyway, the real shortcoming of not just ages, but seasons as well, is iconicism. Of course, icon being an image, usually a venerable image. But simply put, neither Oracle game is iconic by the very definition of the word. They fail to my script killed me again. They fail to evoke images that are either are venerable in and of themselves or represent the game as a whole. I suppose the most iconic image of this duo is the turnstile, in that it is representative of these games, as opposed to being venerable in and of itself. To really drive home my point, I had played this game 3 times prior to this, but for this 4th time, did not remember any of it. People say, I wish I could forget Mario 64, so it would be a new experience all over again. But playing these games, I do not have to make a wish. I don't have to hit myself in the head with a rock real hard, because I get that with them. Visually speaking, that is. I remember the mechanical aspects of them. It is especially true with the dungeons of these games. Outside of Sword and Shield dungeon, I cannot picture them. Outside of individual puzzles. Once the dungeon is over, its interior flees from my brain. Less so the overworld, as there are attempts to make iconic places, some of which are memorable enough, like those I mentioned before, but there are a few too many examples of the developer failing to create memorable assets and frame them in a memorable way. Take Zora's Domain. Being at the bottom of the ocean makes it very novel, and the seashell houses look nice, and the golden Jabu Jabu is very nice as well, definitely along the lines of an iconic asset. But the way the houses are laid out seems slapdash. Most of their interiors do not even have occupants. Even the palace interior is forgettable, having no secret rooms or any kind of interesting furniture / installations to make it more regal. And the music track that plays is the same that plays in Ambi's palace. As I previously mentioned, Lena Village is very forgettable. A few shops and houses scattered about without a sense of forethought. Rolling Ridge might be the worst, as much of it is large empty caverns, populated by interchangeable Goron sprites. No one screen or character standing out. Feels like an incomplete environment. Of course, I am fully aware of Subrosia and Symmetry City and Crescent Isle. I acknowledge that those locales are memorable, but the rest of it flees away from me. Aurally speaking, there is perhaps 3 songs between both games that I can remember. So it is a pretty weak soundtrack. Tarm Runes is great, as is Sorrow, and also as is Nehru's song as well. The MacGuffin music from Link's Awakening that they reuse here sounds nice too, but there is not much for music. And some of the music just kind of sounds bad. Like, I don't think the boss theme is very good. It's fine, but it's the same theme every time, and it's just kind of bleh. Now, someone might say that these games' forgettable look are a product of their home system. And I should not expect a Game Boy game to be of the audiovisual caliber that is Wind Waker or Link to the Past. But that is a silly argument on account of the fact that these games borrowed many of their assets from a game of such caliber. I have no problem retrieving images of Link's Awakening, as it has truly iconic imagery. Not that I'm going to get into it. So, it's clearly not the base look of the Oracle games that hold them back. But that is the biggest flaw with these games, is that they just lack iconicism. Last issue with Ages that I will touch on is the side content. There is the trading quest and the gacha trees and some heart pieces here and there, but that is all there is. Not to say there is no exploration, there is a lot of it, but it is part of the critical path. One thing I like about the exploration is it involves Ralph, the character of Ralph, because not only when he appears is there a bit of characterization with him, he also has this interesting design element with him. You explore for a little bit. You've been given kind of the general area where to go, so you go about the general area, and you fumble around. And then as you get to a certain point, Ralph will show up, and he'll mumble about the next thing that you need to do, something he just overheard. And he's not really even talking to you, he's kind of just talking aloud. But he essentially, after some exploration the player has to do, the game will then like push you in the right direction once more. And I appreciate that extra push, because it's not like an egregious amount of hand holding. It's just like one, it's telling you that you're on the right track, and two, it's giving you just a little more information, and it's providing characterization rather. I don't know what word I said there with Ralph. So I enjoy that little mechanic they added with Ralph. Anyway, getting back to the main exploration, there's also quite a few mini games, but likewise, most of those are part of the critical path. As for the optional content, like with Seasons, most of it yields rings, which are a fun idea, but since 95% of them are either useless or are so limited in their use case that they are essentially useless. I get that they created the rings and gacha trees as extra fluff for those kids who just wanted to plug away at something amidst a long car ride. But for those not confined to moving vehicles, it is very uninspired. Undercooked content. Though at the end of the day, I suppose Ages has enough content in the critical path to make up for the smaller side content. It is a very dense 20-hour game after all. So, that's all I'll say about the game's shortcomings and lesser or less desirable aspects. And with all of that said, how does the Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages score? It has got all the good Zelda stuff, with only a handful of small issues, save for the big issue of iconicism, which is a big deal. Keeps it from being more than the sum of its parts. Throw in the undercooked side content, and my initial estimate of 8.5 may be falling to an 8. Puts me in a tight spot, as I already bribed myself to give it an 8.5. Let us say this. To anybody who listens all the way through, put your appraisal down in the comments of the YouTube version. or, send me an email too if you're listening in the podcast form. But keep in mind, I will not go higher than 8.5 and no lower than 8. Regardless of the outcome, though, this is the best Game Boy game of the ones I have reviewed by a good stretch. So before the show ends, I will rattle off that list. But before that, there is one more topic to cover. And that is, a big selling point of the Oracle games was linking them either by the game link or via a password system. There was a few incentives for this. If you finished one game, you could carry your rings into the next one. New story sections were unlocked, particularly in the case of Seasons, including the true ending shared by both games, as well as items and upgrades. Different rewards are made available according to the order that you play the games, but regardless of that order, once the secret is made known for one game, it can be carried over to the other via the Furore. Via Furore, the Oracle of Secrets, who is found in the same place in both games. You just have to tell her the code. Which code, though? There is the code you receive from one NPC in one game, which you say to another NPC in the other game, but then the receiving NPC will give you a new code, and that is the code you give to Furore. I've never said that out loud. Furore. Frankly, the entire process is a bit arduous and even unintuitive, as the question Furore asks you implies a specific secret rather than any secret. But thankfully, trial and error. This review needs to end. But thankfully, trial and error won the day. Moreover, as I understand it, the catalyst for this flood of secret codes came from linking Oracle of Ages to a completed game of Seasons, which made it all the more baffling that the secrets I was receiving in my new game were intended, for the game I had just completed. Of course, as I already said, there is a built-in reciprocation between the two. And also, these codes you receive can be used in perpetuity, should you successfully hold on to them, though I imagine trading secrets would be much easier between two players with whatever they are playing it on. But for one person, unless you have two separate devices open, as I did, you will need a phone picture or a notepad. As I said, a little arduous. It is worth it, though. You get a great final boss, as well as other new story beats, and you get some real slick items that I will not spoil for you. So if you intend to play both games, definitely link them, as it provides a boost to both the critical path and the side content. So that's it. That's all. That's the review. Questions or comments, send them to nalistenerq@gmail.com, or put it down in the comments to be read on the show. So we're gonna go into rankings now, but before we do that, we'll have a little music break. Before I rattle off the rankings, public service announcement. This is the final Game Boy review for the N64 era, for that 5th gen Nintendo era. There are a few more games I could have reviewed, such as Tokitori and Lufia Returns, also Bionic Commando Elite Forces, or Pokemon Crystal. But I felt no desire. I am sorry. It just was done. In the case of Pokemon Crystal, I played one Pokemon game. I have a general sense for what the next one is going to be. Even though Pokemon Crystal and Silver and Gold specifically did have new ideas and they were really solid, creative, and content rich sequels. But I know how Pokemon game plays and I didn't really want to play another one. As for these other games that I mentioned, I played about 6 hours of Bionic Commando Elite Forces, and I didn't like the game all that much. Mostly it was audiovisual. I think the game's very ugly. And then in terms of gameplay, I was probably just terrible at it, but I thought the gameplay was harsh in a way that I didn't think was fair for how fiddly the controls are. But then again, maybe I was just bad at the game. Point is I didn't really feel comfortable reviewing it. I didn't beat it, and I never really gelled with what it was, even though it sounds cool in concept. Lufia Returns, maybe I should play that one because it's like one of the only other big RPGs on the Game Boy, at least in the color era. Maybe there's like one or two more, but Lufia Returns, comes from a reputable franchise, as I understand it, back on the Super Nintendo, and it might be a solid RPG, but I just didn't want to play a 40-hour RPG on the Game Boy, which I know makes me lazy. The point of this show is for me to really go through, or rather, really put the machine through its paces. But I'm worn out. And then Tokitori 2, I started playing it, and I'm not big on puzzle games, but I can appreciate what they are. But the art style was very ugly. It had this very simple pre-rendered look, and I don't hate pre-rendered games. Pardon me, but this was ugly, and I'm sure it's fine, but just no desire. And there was other games like, what was it called? Extreme Sports by Way Forward, which is a very nice looking game, but I tried to play it for maybe an hour and a half. I just couldn't play it. It's too hard for me to do all the mini games with their button combos and their quick little inputs. So, I'm not going to talk about those games. Anyway, the games I did play, and again, some of the games I'm not reviewing, I also played too. They left me with the impression that the Game Boy Color period of the Game Boy, or just the N64 period with the Game Boy, was kind of crap. Pokemania brought that system back, for a second or third wind, whatever round it was. But aside from the Pokemon games, and aside from Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, and aside from the Game & Watch Gallery games, as well as one or two other games I didn't mention, there really was nothing going on with this system. With 5 years of, 5 years time for it to be releasing games, even if I had played those games I mentioned, that's like 20 some games to talk about. That's pretty lame. And it's hard to really know how many games there are on the Game Boy. There was like 1,500 maybe. But most of those were little brother versions of console games or ports. And like ports of NES games specifically. And on that note, like the thing I liked about the Game Boy, despite the fact that the original unit is a very utilitarian device, to say the least, is that that device, which was an 8-bit system, was emulating 16-bit aesthetics. I remember thinking that Link's Awakening was pretty similar to Link to the Past in terms of its sprite detail. You know, it tells you what I know. I'm not an expert on these things, but, you know, Link's Awakening is a very dense-looking, beautiful game. Kirby's Adventure looks great on there, too. Super Mario Land 2 looks like Super Mario World in a lot of ways. So, that the Game Boy had this feeling of punching up. It was going above its weight class. It was, for how limited it was a surprising little system with what it could do. But for the Game Boy Color, it seems like they went back to an NES graphical aesthetic for a lot of games. And it just looked so unimpressive, to the point that, colors are nice, and this is probably the best way to play Game Boy games. Just the unit is the best unit as far as the Game Boy units are concerned. But I don't know, just the games they released in this time were not impressive, and it was quite an anemic little lineup. And that's a real shame, because the console games don't just operate alone. Like there is the handheld pillar too, which is arguably more important than the console games themselves in terms of finances anyway. But for this system, which was super popular, especially around this time, to have so few games, so few original games, and those games to be very unimpressive, it's not a good thing. Like the Wario Land games, for instance. The first one came out before the N64 was out, but these next two, they were bad. Like 2 is pretty good, I guess, or well, it's not pretty good. It's fine. 3 is not quite as good as fine, but their level design is so absent, and they just feel like you're moving left or right with very little thought, and they're not very good looking. 2 specifically was incredibly muted in its color. It was originally a black and white game, and then they repurposed it as a Game Boy Color game, and it really didn't utilize the colors as far as reviewers were concerned, and as far as I'm concerned too. Frankly, honestly, I think while I would say the Oracle games are the best games on this system, and Pokemon Blue is what it is, it's not my favorite thing, but it's definitely an achievement. I would say the games I had the most fun with, aside from those, was the Game & Watch series. The Game & Watch Gallery Trio. I really enjoyed those games. They were simple, but there was a lot of fun and joy in them. And, there was enough variation and content in them. You had like 8 to 10 mini games. And that were like, arcade style mini games. So it wasn't like super shallow, even if it was essentially one dimensional. But, I'm just going to read off the list, and I'll state the scores that I gave these games to provide a picture of how I feel about them. So, starting from the bottom, at number 13, we have Shantae by Way Forward, which people tout that game as something. I think that game is crap. And here's how I know it's crap. I didn't use a walkthrough or anything. I figured out all of the puzzles except for like the last one at the very end of the game, because at that point I'd given up. And that puzzle, it's not a puzzle, but that section sucks. I figured out everything in this game, and I still didn't feel any satisfaction. So that's a 4.5 out of 10 game. That game sucks. Like, that game makes so many cardinal sins in terms of design. That's at number 13. At number 12, we have Wario Land 3, which I gave 5.5 out of 10 to. It doesn't get a speech like Shantae. It's just bleh. There's just no good level design in it, and it's super boring looking for a game that features Wario Land, like the aesthetic and the world you're in. Number 11 is Wario Land 2, and number 6, definitely more interesting, but super slow-paced as a platformer. Number 10 is Mega Man Extreme 2, which is also a 6 out of 10 game. It's just bits of content from Mega Man X and Mega Man X2 in a much less impressive package with all of the same issues those games have. So that's a 6 out of 10. Number 9 is Donkey Kong Land 2, which is a 6.5 out of 10. And it's actually a very impressive port of Diddy's Conquest. But it's just a worse version of that game. Overall, it's just essentially a port. So, no originality, and it's just kind of a bad way to play a really good game. Number 8 is Mole Mania, which is a 7 out of 10. I'll admit that the game's one core puzzle conceit essentially will fatigue me a little more than halfway through, but it has a lot of personality for what kind of game it is, and it's very organic in what kind of puzzles you're solving. And, it's got those iconic character designs. I'm stuttering. That only Miyamoto can come up with. So yeah, Mole Mania at number 8. Now we're starting to get good. 7, 6, and 5 are Game & Watch Gallery 3, Game & Watch Gallery 2, and Game & Watch Gallery. I've already stated why I like those games. They just make me laugh. Like the little vignettes that they put you in are just so weird and goofy, and you just clue into what's going on without there being any kind of lead up. Number 4 is Oracle of Seasons. A very good game. It could have been a little more beefed up with a better story. And honestly, I don't even care about story. Just like a better, stronger context. And a more interesting overworld. But, still very good. A solid meat and potatoes Zelda game. So that's 7.5 out of 10. Yeah, number 3, we have Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, which is an 8 out of 10. It's just a Penaldupon game, but Penaldupon is very good. Or Tetris Attack, for those who don't call it Penaldupon. So, it's not using the Pokemon brand all that well, but it's a Penaldupon game. And then number 2 is Pokemon Blue with an 8 out of 10. Most of that praise comes from Steven of Level 1 Sword, though I'll admit he made some good points in the game's favor. It's Pokemon, it started Pokemania. And then before we say number 1, which we already know what number 1 is, here's a few games that I fell through on. We have Kirby Block Ball, which is essentially a breakout clone, and maybe Breakout to me just isn't actually an interesting concept. And then Bionic Commando Elite Forces and Tokitori, which I played like 10 minutes of or 30 minutes of. Oof. And yeah, those are all the games I played on the Game Boy Color. And again, as I said, there's a few more I could touch on, but there's really only a few more. So, with all that said, number 1 is Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. Either with an 8 or an 8.5. I mean, honestly, it's probably an 8.5. But the fact that it's not iconic and I just forget it as I play it, it's kind of a big thing. So that is the Game Boy ranking as it stands. It will continue to get new entries as I go back further, because there was Game Boy games coming out prior to this time. when the N64 was Nintendo's best boy, if you will. So for now, we'll add more Game Boy games to that list. But that is the list as it stands. So that will cap off the show. To those who listened or watched, thank you very much. Because I can tolerate the sound of my own voice, but I don't want to be the only one listening to it, which is a very pathetic and depressing thing to say. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I very much appreciate it. And if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. With all that said, have a blessed day, and I hope you listen to the next review.